Stanford University.
Thanks, Ernestine, for the invitation. It's good to be with you all. I'm a GSB alum from '92, which is kind of incredible, incredibly long time ago. I'll give a little bit more on Nick, since he won't say it about himself. He's going to be really the true star of the show. So Nick just finished, as Ernestine said, leading one of Summit's companies that actually got itself a bit, in trouble before he showed up on some of the very things that we're going to be talking about here. Basically turned it around, made it a fabulous company, kind of an okay to great type of story, and just recently sold to Symantec Corporation very successfully. He's undergrad and Master of Science in Computer Science from Harvard, and did his own e-commerce startup back in the day where you had to raise all this venture capital money to do that, and it kind of flamed out in the first tech bubble, as did my first startup, which was worth $1 billion in early 2000, and then was worth way less than that about 6 weeks later. So both of us have had some successes and some scars that we want to share with you today. So the task that we were given was to talk about making the team work, executive board and partners, how to create a winning culture. So here's our interpretation of that based on what you all have done in this course so far. And I know some of you currently have startups or aspire to be in startups. We're sort of assuming that we're at a point in the discussion where you've gotten the company past the initial total raw startup stage. You've got some pieces of it together, and the question is, how do you build out a really fulsome team and get everyone pulling in the same direction? This isn't an ad for Summit, but the lens that we're talking about venture capital is different for everybody. My lens that I bring to this is the growth equity lens. A lot of my experience at Amazon first, but also the work that I do and my colleagues do at Summit. So Summit is not in the early stage venture business. Wow.
The slides kind of messed up.
Yeah, they may all be. We, about 25 years ago, basically invented, along with one or two other firms, what's now called the growth equity industry, which is working with companies, mostly in technology, very high growth companies that in the vast majority of cases have actually bootstrapped their way to the point where they're profitable, they're growing like weeds, and they're actually owned by their founders. And we've built a business of finding those companies and convincing them to essentially let us partner with them to accomplish very much the stuff we're talking about today. How do you create a world-class, great organization that can sustain anything? Or as a entrepreneur put it to me this morning, I've hacked my way out of the jungle to the dirt road. Now I got to make my way to the highway, and we kind of help people get from the dirt road to the highway. My own work with companies, just as points of reference, we'll be talking about, ranges from companies like Wildfire Interactive, which some of you may know, and you should work with them after you graduate. Awesome firm, social marketing software. We backed this company, was doing $100,000 a month in revenue 2 years ago. 13 people over a bodega on El Camino. They've been profitable ever since, and now have 250 people over in Redwood Shores, and have burned all of $1 million in doing that. And a big task there has been exactly this: the development of a world-class team, ranging to Vent Privé, which is up here, a company that when we invested was doing $200 million in revenue, 40% pre-tax margins, 40% growth. They invented the whole flash sale model that here is Gilt Group and those things. They kind of copied Vent Privé. Talk about a business that doesn't need money, owned by 3 guys. But we got the chance to work with them to develop what is now a $1 billion company that will soon be, I hope, a public company. Other companies with Stanford roots, Tiny Prints, some of you may know, an e-commerce company that was 2 Stanford Business School alums and friends who bootstrapped a beautiful business to about $25 million in revenue and profitability. Shutterfly wanted to buy him 3 years ago for $100 million. I convinced him instead to let us invest and build to the point where the company was of public scale itself, and it sold for about $450 million a couple months ago. And then there are companies that Ubiquity is a company just went public. When we invested a year and a half ago, the business was doing $100 million in revenue, had 16 employees, $30 million in pre-tax, doubling every year, owned by this one Apple engineer who, I say this in a loving way, is just a madman. He's just a crazy genius. He wanted to, though, have an Apple, he wanted to have a public company. And he hates venture capitalists, doesn't think much of people like CFOs and the rest. And so gently and lovingly, we worked in a place where we've got a great team there and a public company worth $2 billion. And then there are companies that, that struggle. So we see a lot of companies that go quickly from sort of nothing to say $20 million of revenue, and then they go sideways. Postini, a wonderful business, ended up selling to Google, went very quickly to $20 million, and then went totally sideways for like 1.5 to 2 years. And the big difference that was made was when we changed a bunch of stuff that was going on the team and culturally, and they took off and were acquired for $650 million by Google. And then LiveOffice. So LiveOffice, Nick is going to talk about a little bit more. A great example of how you want to do this. A company we invest in, a nice business, growing fast in the SaaS or cloud email archiving space. They're growing very quickly under 2 founders. But sometimes as an investor you get sort of talked into stuff. And the truth is the product and the team was not as strong as I thought when we invested. The first thing we did was recruit some great board members. Nick had led the creation of the biggest competitor in that industry, a Symantec archiving business from 20 to about 200 million in revenue. We recruited him. He was out thinking about doing a startup. We recruited him the board of LiveOffice. And after about 6 months, the founders of that company and we all looked at each other and said, hey, could you do this? He took over as CEO of the company. Most of the changes that you made were around culture and team. And we ended up with a fabulous outcome. So again, we're going to assume for the moment that you have a little business, maybe not so little business, that you got a great idea, you have some money, and you have heroic founders. Some of you are already in this situation now. Some of you will be soon. And really, what you need next is a fulsome, great team of A's and alignment of those people. One thing you'll learn here is Nick is the king of like PowerPoint and clip art. He tells me that's like from being in a Fortune 50 company. You like mess around with PowerPoint a lot. Put another way, the companies that we see very commonly, they're doing great. They're maybe doing 5, 10, 15, $20 million of revenue. But really when you dig down, there's a great CEO or founding, couple of people. There's maybe one real, horse who's carrying product. And in a lot of cases, you get a really good investor, sometimes not. And then you have a lot of great or okay people who are sort of individual contributors. And that can go okay for a while, but that's the company that always ends up kind of going sideways in a CEO who is really, really stressed out and can't sustain what they're doing. And it's a little bit like, since we just came off the Super Bowl, being a quarterback with sort of a spotty front line and a couple guys in the backfield, but not really, it can't last. And really what you need to get is surrounded by really strong builders. And by a builder, I mean people who you don't say, hey, can you do this by next Friday? You say, hey, 2 years from now, we need to have 20% market share in Europe, whatever it is, go. And that person can go and do those things. And then you not only need a bunch of talented individuals, you need them all working together, by the same plan. So what we're going to talk about here are really the steps, sort of practically speaking. If you've got a startup that's got some momentum, it's got something going on, it's got some revenue, how do you sort of practically speaking and on the right timeline, not too fast, not too slow, accomplish that sort of great team that's got alignment? First is defining the culture you want to build. You got to do that early. When do I start to bring in senior talent? By that I mean people who aren't part of the initial founding group, people who have experience doing what you're doing in this company, and how do I balance too soon versus too late on that one? Who am I looking for in those roles, and who must I avoid at all costs in those roles? How do I get them? A non-trivial problem. Same question really for the board of directors. When is the right time to start building really a formal board of directors, and why? What kind of people am I looking for there, and who must I avoid at all costs? I'm not naming names, just types. And then critically, obviously, as this senior team grows and my organization grows, how do I get everyone pulling in the same direction, both in terms of the culture and in the execution? And you've heard this many times, I'm sure, but it's not a coincidence why 20 million tends to be a point at which a lot of companies kind of go sideways. That's about 75 to 125 people, where the CEO just cannot know everyone's name, cannot know what makes everybody tick. And if you don't have the bench in place, you're going to have problems. You got to get people pulling together. From the CEO's perspective, at this point, what decisions should I make, and what do I need to let go of and let others decide? And if it's not working, how do I know if it's not working, and how do I autocorrect? So we're going to go kind of point by point over half an hour on these and give us some observations. And I'll call them observations that are formed by best practices and mistakes we've made at scores of companies sort of jointly. No rule applies to every company, but we think these are ones to carry around with you. I'll turn it over to Nick to define how to define the culture.
Great. Okay, so culture is a word that's thrown around a lot in companies. And actually, let's just ask a question here. If I asked one of you to define culture, who wants to be brave and say what is a company culture all about? Anyone take a stab?
Maybe the predominant mindset that the employees embody when they go about their work tasks.
Yeah, I think that's a great definition. Any other?
Shared values and styles of work.
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. That's good. Any other thoughts? And what you're going to see here is that different companies, and we've got a couple of examples, define their cultures very differently. One of the most important things to think about with culture is you need to define something. It's one of those areas where having something, even if it's not perfect, is actually way more important than getting it totally right. And I'll talk about that. So I don't know, everyone saw Facebook filed to go public last week. Anyone read the S1 and the Hacker Way culture thing? Anyone see this? But you should go read it if you didn't. Mark Zuckerberg has his letter to the investors, and he talks about the Hacker Way culture, which is basically about their approach to always innovating and being comfortable not getting everything right. Really, it's more important to get things out and use than to get them totally right, and basically constantly iterate. If you look at how many people have flown Southwest Airlines, think about your experience on Southwest and what kind of culture do you think that company has based on your experience flying there? What words would you throw out with Southwest?
The flight attendants try to have fun with the safety announcements.
Yeah, fun, exactly. Yeah, the safety announcements are really funny. What else? Anything else jumps out? I don't know if you've seen that they have all these hearts all around. Like their actual stock symbol is love, L-U-V, and it's all about kind of love and fun. And you can see here, this is a photo from one of their company events. A lot of people use Netflix. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's actually a great presentation online. And actually, if you do nothing else, go see the Netflix presentation. Go Google Netflix culture presentation. They've got a great 80-slide deck on their whole culture. And they basically talk about what's important to Netflix employees. And I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but this is an example of a culture that's very well defined. They have a list of very explicit values that matter. And you talked about values. They talk about the importance of high-performance individuals. It's really, at Netflix, they talk about being a sports team, not a family. So it's kind of this idea that it's not all about us just getting together because we like each other, but it's actually about us getting together to win. And that's Netflix. It's actually very different from Southwest Airlines. They talk about freedom and responsibility, this whole idea that everyone in the company should be allowed to do what they want within their judgment, as long as they're thinking about the interests of Netflix. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but they have their own culture. And what's really interesting is you go company by company, you look at older companies and new companies. One of the common attributes across great companies is they have something unique that kind of is the thread that ties the people that they have together. And that's really what their culture is. One of the things really important I want to share with you is in this first question of how to define your culture, it's very important to think about it from the beginning. Because I actually had an experience where, as I'll talk about, where I had to go into a company and kind of retrofit a culture. And that's also doable, but it's a lot harder because obviously you end up with a lot of people and they were hired under different cultures. And how do you figure out which are the right people? And can you change people? And we'll talk more about that. This is Larry and Sergey in their garage at Google in the early days. And their idea is really, if you can define a culture then, it's the best way to do it. It's pretty hard. It's hard to think about two people, usually it's friends, and how are they going to create a culture and even think about a culture? They're focused on creating a product and creating a business. But the earlier you can do it, the better. So a couple tips I'm going to share with you. In terms of defining a culture, what I've seen is there are kind of three general approaches to doing it. And you'll probably read about other approaches over time, but here's three ideas. So one is, even if you have two people or one person or five people, what is the unique thing that binds you all together, right? So if you start a company, often you do it with friends or people you know. What's that thing that you all share in common that caused you to actually say we want to start a company together? Or maybe you're already at 10 people or 15 people. I call that kind of emergent because that kind of is the culture that emerges from what you share today. By contrast, another way to think about your culture is what do you need to be? So if you're, let's say, as an example, your business is all about, building devices to monitor people's diabetes, right? Your culture can't be about fun and parties and getting things 80% right. Like it's a business that actually the details matter a lot and people's lives and things like that. So what culture do you need to achieve whatever your startup's mission is. And then the third piece, which you should never minimize, is you as the founder or the founding team. What do you care about? Like, what are the things that matter to you? Why did you want to start a company in the first place? For a lot of people, they didn't just want to start a company because they're building this product. It's actually because they had some personal desire to be able to go, change the world or make people happy or whatever it is, right? And those three elements, kind of, what is your team? What do you need to be as a business? And then what do you want to be personally? I think those are three useful tools, even when you're 2 or 3 people, to think about what your culture should be. A couple tips along the way. One thing is, there's a lot. If you look up different companies' cultures, you'll sometimes see pages and pages or a whole book written about them or lots of different bullet points. To the extent you can actually simplify whatever is your essence into a small number of bullets, and I'll show you some examples, it's really, it makes it a lot easier because then people can really live it and remember it. My view is always 3 points is what human beings are the most easy to remember, right? So if you can have 3 things that really simplify your culture, that's great. Second thing is, definitely whatever you define as your company culture, it has to be something that you're going to live every day. So if your company's all about fun and enjoyment, and you're like an introvert who doesn't like to hang out with people, it's probably not a good culture, right? So it has to be something that you totally love in your heart and soul. And the third point, which I made up front, is it's way more important to come up with something that you can live every day, even if it's not perfect, even if it's not every single thing you always wanted to build in a company, like even if it's just one thing. Our culture is honesty. We're just gonna be honest, right? And you're gonna be honest every day. Or our culture is we are very direct and we tell you exactly how it is and we don't sugarcoat it at all. Whatever the culture is, it's way more important to have something you're gonna do every day. So it's another tip to think about. So my experience, this company, as Harrison said, LiveOffice was founded in 1998, so quite a while back, perhaps when some of you were in high school or elementary school, a long time ago, and by other people, and is actually founded in Southern California. And the company actually had its own emergent culture, which is really a really fun, laid back, irreverent culture. And I actually kind of embrace that because for me personally, one of the reasons I always wanted to work in a company and run a company is to make it more fun and less just about work. And so as an example, we did all kinds of fun and very Southern California things like this contest called Pimp My Cube, where we would have different departments decorate their department cubes, and it was kind of fun. But now on the flip side, our business was all about something very serious, which was searching companies' email for legal purposes. So not laid back and irreverent. Actually, if we got it wrong, there'd be like lawsuits and things like that. So our aspirational element of our culture was actually all about really, really basic things like doing a great job on service and being very reliable, right? And then for me personally, whenever I wanted to, way back when I said I want to be a CEO, I want to start my own company, et cetera, one of the big things I wanted out of running a company is to be able to run a company that really lived compassion with all of its employees, to each other, as well as to our customers. So what I did was I said, look, the people that are here are already kind of fun and irreverent, but we need to deliver a very reliable service, and I personally care about compassion, and that basically became the LiveOffice culture. So it wasn't perfect. There was like about 1 million other things I wanted to put up there. I mean, I wanted people to be focused on learning and self-improvement, all these other things, and I just said, look, let's come up with a really simple way to think about it. This is what our customers need, this is what I care about, and this is who we are today, and that basically became our culture. So that's kind of a way to think about if you're starting from scratch, how do you create your culture and what are the different ingredients you use to bring it together?
So bringing in senior talent, you're threading a needle. That's good, Nick. I like that. So if you're part of a founding group of people, there's this passion, there's this sort of zeal to create something, and a lot of times people are very nervous about bringing in new people who are senior, people who have been around a lot, and there's good reasons to be sort of hesitant about that. There's a pro and con, and there's risks around being too early in bringing in new senior people in that team around you, and there's risks to being too late. What we would tell you is that by and large, the mistake that entrepreneurs make more often is being too late. And they do that, one, because they're concerned about screwing up the culture, and that's very, very important. And there's basically no good time to make a bad hire. So you got to get the hiring right. They're often concerned about the financial impact of people because they can be more expensive if they've been there and done that to some extent before. But the truth is, a great person way more than pays for themselves if they're a builder, as I've defined them. And lastly, and this is a bad reason, and I've fallen prey to this many, many times in my operating career, you just don't make the time to do it. It's hard. It takes a long time to find great people. You got to be really picky. But part of what we're here to tell you is if you get yourself in that enviable position where you and a bunch of people got something good going, literally as the CEO of that company, you got to block out 4 or 5 hours a day for recruiting great talent. Sometimes technical talent, but sometimes leadership talent. Go ahead.
If you're at the growth equity stage, how do you feel about going through an executive recruiter, just like a heritage struggle or something like that?
Yeah, executive recruiters or headhunters are, like many other service providers, 2 of them are really good out of 10. You got to manage them, you got to be tough on them, all that. But yes, that's another thing. A lot of my entrepreneurs, I love them because they're cheap. And they say, oh, it's going to cost me 50 grand to find that CFO. You know what? It's worth it. Let's do that. You need to make those investments and do that. We'll talk a little bit more about how to find people, but that's clearly something to do. Quickly, we can talk about like who do you need in these roles?
Yeah. So one segue to explain this is, when the first startup I started in college, which Harrison alluded to, is an internet boom and bust story in the late 90s. Started it, came out to California, raised venture capital, and hired like 20 executives. I mean, literally like a VP of everything you can imagine. They're all very experienced. And I kind of went through this kind of the other extreme, which is over hiring people. And one of the things I took away was there's a ton of value of bringing in the right people and experienced people, but it's all about picking the spots that make a lot of sense for what you're doing and also who you are. So if you think about your business first, one of the things to think about at core is, am I doing something that's brand new, like a totally different thing that no one's ever done before? So if you look at the top of the slide, on one extreme, you've got, Pinterest, right? Like a photo pinning website or something, which there's nobody who's ever had experience in photo pinning websites, right? So it's not like something you can go hire somebody who's done it 3 times before. If you founded that company, you're the first one to do it. On the other extreme, you have a new medical device or a new semiconductor design. There's people who've done those things for decades, right? So experience actually helps a lot. In the same way, if you think of the different functional roles, if you're the founder, you have the product vision, you can't really outsource that. You can't hire somebody to take that over. You're the person with that vision. But there's areas that actually people have done before. CFO is a great example. Once you get to that point where you need a CFO, there's a lot of people that have done it before, and learning on the job is actually hazardous to some extent. So there's roles where experience matters a lot. There's industries where experience matters a lot. You want to think about your company in that context. The one area that I think experience always helps in is managing people, because it's kind of one of those things that no matter what, you can learn on the job, but actually there's some intuition you get by doing it over time. And as your company grows, the more you have more people, the more important that skill is to potentially bring in. The second thing to think about is kind of yourself. So what do you like? So if you think about your team and bringing in extra people to help, think about this Venn diagram, which is, it's real simple, but what are you great at individually, right? Even if you're straight out of college, you're going to be great at something, right? And what do you love, which is equally important. And then what does your business need, right? I mean, it's pretty basic, but if you kind of look at this and say, okay, my business needs all the stuff in here, and I'm great at this and I love this, so I should probably focus on this here. But what about all this stuff over here where either I don't love it or I'm not great at it? A real simple rule of thumb on how to decide who to hire, fill in these gaps basically. And then the third thing is kind of thinking about your existing team, because obviously in many cases, you start a company, maybe you have co-founders, you have early team. One of the big things is, how do those people scale? And this is a term you'll hear a lot from investors especially, which is, is your team going to scale? Are your employees going to scale? And one of the big things I think people are thinking about is, over time, you kind of add more and more to somebody's plate, and everything works well, and all of a sudden doesn't work. And what actually I've seen a lot is people get stressed. So if you have a co-founder, if you have somebody that works for you, and you keep giving them more responsibility, maybe more people working for them, more customers, whatever it is, and all of a sudden they're yelling at you in meetings or freaking out, that's sort of the time that they're probably not scaling. So the kind of 3 things to think about, basically what you want to do, what your team wants to do, and what does your business need.
I think that's still using it.
In terms of then figuring out who you want and basically who you're looking for, a couple tips on kind of the recruiting the team and basically how to find complementary people. One thing I found is there is almost nothing that can actually replace the experience of going through a startup. It's kind of one of those. It's just like being in a big company and being very experienced about being in a big company. Being in a startup is totally different, and it's one of those experiences you just need to go through. And so when you look at hiring people, one of the things I'd encourage you to do is, get the person with a lot of experience and the right experience, but if they've never been through a startup, you really need to look at them with a skeptical eye to make sure they can remember what it's like to be, or even know what it's like to be at a 5-person company or 10-person company or a 20-person company. Some people just get shell-shocked by that. Second thing, one of the best things I've seen is if you can find somebody you worked with before. And it's kind of one of those things where it's just intangible. If you know how to work with somebody, either somebody you knew from classes or somebody you worked with professionally, there's something that's really hard to replace with somebody off the street. So that's very, very, very powerful. And the third thing is when you bring somebody into your startup, especially if you're just starting something for the first time and you're coming out of school, making sure that the people on that early team are aligned with you in terms of your hunger. Because if you're starting a company, you're hungry, right? You want to go do something. You might be hungry to make money or hungry to change the world or create a great product, but you're hungry. You're not going to stop. And if you bring people in who aren't equally hungry, there's a real mismatch. And you start seeing it in the Saturday nights and the Tuesday evenings at 11 o'clock, and it just creates a lot of stress. So really thinking about those people that are equally hungry to you, simple things like, are they at that phase where they really want to do something big, or have they already done something big? And this is the dilemma that comes in, because the people that are really, really experienced sometimes aren't as hungry. And so you're kind of trying to thread that needle of very hungry people that are still bringing in a good experience. So in terms of when you get those people, a couple tips on interviewing candidates, bringing in people into your team, and preserving the culture. This is a simple one, but a lot of people, still when you go interview somebody, the standard thing is, can you give me some references? And they give you, 5 people they worked with, and hopefully you probably all figured this out, that those 5 people are all their friends, and that they're all going to say great things. You don't have to call them because they're all going to be super glowing, right? And one of the things that I've started doing, a lot of companies do, is basically your blind reference, right, which is go on LinkedIn and find people that these people know that call them, and actually maybe even do that before the interview. So basically, there's this bias where once you meet somebody and you're trying to bring in some new, marketing person or salesperson or whatever to your company, and you meet them and you start to like them, right? And almost everyone that's good is likable in an interview. But the reality is then you do those reference checks afterwards, and you've already fallen in love with the candidate, and then you listen to the reference for all the good things, and you don't hear the bad things. A lot of people start doing blind references before interviews, before you ever meet somebody. Just kind of go check them out, to basically do a background check. Second thing is, this is all about culture, right? So how do you find that cultural fit with these people coming into your company, especially experienced people coming into your company? It's really, really tricky. One tip is to do a lot of kind of out of work social interactions, and maybe even have them go meet and go out to dinner with people that are working with, but maybe not you there, right? So have them go out with your team and see what your team thinks of them, right? So really try to create a lot of sessions to learn about that person on an individual basis. And then a third thing is, if you're hiring senior people in your company and it's a pretty small company, you've got to say a lot of no before you say yes. It's easy to get starstruck because you'll find tons of people that have lots of experience and they look amazing and they're going to transform your company. But it's just such a big decision. And you really, Harrison said it right, that you need to bring these people in, you have to spend a lot of time on it. But you also shouldn't jump to the first person that looks like they have a great resume. You have to say a lot of no before you say yes. So I think, this is me.
A few more ideas for sourcing people.
Yeah. So another thing, how do you find all these people? So, and Harrison alluded to this before, a couple different tips. One is investors are super helpful. So obviously Summit has been a great resource for us. They're on our board for the last few years and helped us find a lot of our candidates for our senior management team, actually helped us find our CFO, our head of operations, a number of different folks. And basically one thing that's great is they know who's actually good and whose resume just looks good, right? And so really being able to kind of get through all of the beautiful titles on people's resumes to what people have actually done. Second thing, search firms. So somebody asked about this. Some of these retained search firms, like I think you asked about Heidrick and Struggles, right? They're actually pretty good in a way in that they force process on you. So Harrison talked about the fact that you got to spend a lot of time on this, right? If you're going to bring somebody in, it's hours a day. And actually starting a search, one of the things that's nice is it forces you into that process. Forces you to spend a couple hours a day to really think about who you're bringing in. And then third simple tip is, if you're a small company, you're looking to grow it, you can find hungry people that are experienced by finding the number 2 person at a company that was successfully exited. Yeah, oftentimes the number 1 person in a certain, like the number 1 finance person, number 1 engineering person, isn't as hungry because they've already done it. But the number 2 person was sitting there the whole time, got to see success, but now wants to be the leader and wants to be the person that can make it happen. It's a simple tip, but a good one to look for. So board of directors.
So the other part of your team should be over time a board of directors and some sort of informal advisors. Anybody here ever been in a private company board meeting? Okay, a few. So some boards are really dysfunctional. Most of them are kind of so-so functional, and some of them are highly functional, by which I mean they can really, really make a difference in making your company everything that it can be. And a lot of, especially first-time entrepreneurs, approach the whole board of directors thing with a sort of skepticism to begin with. And I want to encourage you to think about these folks as a resource, again, like your backfield, if you will, if you're, I was going to say Tom Brady, but I'm not going to say it. So first of all, why create a board? So first of all, a board is about corporate governance. And if you have an investor at this point in your venture, you need to have a corporate governance overlay, of course, because you're playing with other people's money. I was thinking, how much money did you and I blow in the first internet bubble of Sequoia, KP, and Excel?
I think I blew about $50 million. I don't know how much you blew.
About 80. So,
Yeah.
So it was.
It's fun.
Yeah. So, but I don't mean that in a cavalier way. I'm just saying that, times like that time that happened in 98, 99, 2000, there's some serious risk out there. And you're trying to be aggressive and trying to do the right thing, but you're taking a lot of risk with other people's money, and it's not Summit's money, it's the teacher retirement system of the state of California's money that I get to invest on their behalf. So it's serious business, but it should be about much, much more than that. You should think of your board as people who are going to help you do fundamentally 3 things. If they're really good, they help you focus on what you should focus on. Help you figure out what are your priorities. We all know, and especially in the cockpit of a startup, you got to figure out every day what are the top 3 things that really matter. Really good board members and advisors will help you focus on the right things faster. They'll help you get those things done faster or better than you would have if they weren't around. And they will help you see around corners or avoid landmines, help you avoid big mistakes. If they're good counselors and advisors, they won't walk around, like they own the joint and telling you how everything should be done, but they should help you see around corners. Implicit here is they should also help with things like recruiting, which we talked about, introductions to customers, and just sort of overall credibility. Important here is that the people you select as board members need to be hardworking for you. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these criteria, but a good board member is putting in a lot of work on behalf of your company. At any given time, for the 4 or 5 companies on whose boards I'm privileged to serve, I got a whole to-do list of stuff I'm working on for them. Recruiting project over here, a sales introduction over there, trying to find a buyer for them over there, and it should take a lot of your investors' time. I often find that entrepreneurs are really sketchy about building a board because they think they're going to lose control of their business. I'm talking about here about situations where from a voting control, from a stock ownership point of view, the entrepreneurs have control of the business, but let's say a typical structure for a board that works well would be you've got maybe 2 founders, let's say 2 founders own 60% of the stock of a company. And the 2 of them are on the board. You've got 1 board member who's an investor because that investor owns much of the remainder of the company. And then you want the great idea is to go out and find 2 really high value folks, independent board members, perhaps people like a Nick, someone who's done before what you're trying to do. You're not going to lose control of your company by setting up your board. It gets technical, but for a Delaware C corporation or an LLC, you can structure things. Zuckerberg is obviously the premier example, such that if even it's just 2 of you with a 5-person board, don't worry, you can keep control of your business. And if you got the right people, you can go places you wouldn't otherwise be able to go. Things to avoid with board members, and I've been a board member of many companies, and I've also been an operator with board members. Folks, who kind of blow in, check their BlackBerry half the time, give you a few huge ideas, and then blow out. That can be, being an entrepreneur or being an operator with big responsibilities, and certainly a founder entrepreneur, it can be a lonely, scary job. And if you have people who aren't really paying attention, it can frankly be pretty demoralizing. Secondly, and it's a sin in our industry, folks who are kind of really full of themselves. And the combination of being distracted and egotistical creates a situation where a board meeting is something you sort of try to get through without too much disruption to your business. That's clearly not where you want to be. And friendly, good, but not friends. We see a lot of companies where their brother-in-law is on the board because they feel comfortable about that because they know that person will never, ever totally disagree with them. Just a bad idea over time with very rare exceptions. You want someone who's got independent heft who will tell you if you got spinach in your teeth, figuratively speaking. So we see these errors a lot. You don't want these. You want humble, hardworking people who are going to do a ton of work for you. If they're famous, if they have awesome, networks, and we put a lot of those people on our boards, great, but don't get the famous one at the expense of the one who's going to be humble and hardworking. Take the less famous one who's going to really bring it every day over the more famous one every time. And of course, the combo is the perfect one. All right, so you've been assembling over a period of a year or two these really great key players and these builders within your organization from the executive point of view. Hopefully you've built a board, you're well aligned with your investor board members, and if you're doing well, you've got one or two folks from industry who are helping you. The board we put together at LiveOffice, the weakness we had there was you, obviously, was awesome. Sales and marketing was an area we needed, and then just the whole finance and operations side. And we brought in a guy who's a brilliant salesman who had built a company in that industry to $300 million, sold it to Microsoft for $300 million. And the other was the CFO of a company that grew to be worth $2 billion right now, Technologies. Those two people were, I think, invaluable, certainly to me and certainly to you, with what they could bring. But how do you get everybody pulling on the same page, or pulling on the same oars?
Yeah, just wondering, how do you pay board members? Do you pay them with shares or actually just?
Yeah, good question. I meant to ask that. That also makes people nervous about bringing them in. Typically, with younger growth companies, we're talking now not about the the investor board members who, of course, they are minding their shares. It's not as bad as you think. Most of them are doing it principally because they love entrepreneurs, they love the process, and they want to be a coach and a helper. There's typically with companies sub the, say, $50, $100 million level, what we'll see is an option package that vests over some period of time, like a normal option package, for maybe, depending on the company and the value and the heft of the person, maybe 0.25%, maybe 0.5%, over some vesting period. That's kind of, market for a lot of these roles. And generally, you pay their airfare. And that has been enough to get us, literally the chairman of AT&T and some former, very big people. So you got this team, but you gotta still make sure that everybody is pulling in the same direction. Cultural alignment. First, as in the phrase that Collins made famous, you gotta have the right people on the bus. No matter what you do, and mission. If you got a bad apple, it ain't gonna work. You have to lead by example and walk the walk, as Nick said. Lot of companies, and the Netflix presentation does a good job of talking about this, where all the right words are there on the wall, and then the CEO does something totally different all the time. And it just creates this air of cynicism, and it's just totally bogus. Simplify it, as Nick said, and then just repeat it. Working for Bezos, you just had this stuff pound into your head day in, day out, his 5 main sort of aphorisms. You were just relentless, at LiveOffice, trying to turn that culture about these ideas. Say it all the time, and the saying is that only when you as the CEO are just ready to puke, if you hear it one more time, is it starting to get into people's noggins. And then you gotta tie it to recognitions and rewards. We talk about, we're about integrity, we're about, hustle or whatever, and then you promote somebody to a significant role who isn't that, you've blown it all. People look at who gets paid, who gets promoted, who gets praised, period. So some techniques that I've seen that have been incredibly effective at this. This was Amazon's cultural scorecard around about my era in the late 90s and early 2000s. And Jeff, Amazon's been an incredibly successful organization, and some of that is just the pure genius of Jeff. But an awful lot of it is actually about the culture and values and principles that he's pounded into that organization. In general, when companies get bigger, and you see it even as they go from 20 to 100 people, the thing that happens is the mean level of quality and talent starts creeping down, and even worse, the variance around the mean gets wider. And that's a problem, because you start having people in the organization that the people out on this end, who you love, start to go, really? Are we really part of the same team? I'm not sure I get that. What you really want to do is have a very high median level of talent and quality, and a low variance around the mean, and methods to drive that. So these were the Amazon cultural norms at the time, and they've refined them a bit over time, but these are some big ones. I won't go through them all. We can make this deck available, but this is a really good one. So customer centricity, a habit of mind where you're always thinking, what's the customer's experience, and working back from there. Ownership. You hear about any problem, it's your problem until you find someone else who says, I've got that problem. Apolitical, I love this one, does not optimize for optics is Jeff's phrase. So the whole thing about, I'm going to do this because it'll look good. When you interviewed at Amazon, or when you interviewed someone, you rated the person on these metrics. So you organized all your questions to try to get at, are they political or apolitical? You know, and people will tell stories about their career that basically tell you they're a highly political animal. They may be great somewhere, but that would let you go, he gets a 2 on optimizing for optics. Then, importantly, every time you were reviewed or reviewed your people, you reviewed them on these same metrics. And then real stuff happened. At one point when I was there, I won't name names, an extraordinarily senior member of management who Wall Street loved, who executed great, was clearly someone who optimized for optics and was political. One of these people has always got the 3-level chess game going on. And Bezos whacked him, just whacked him. And the street was like, what? But everyone in that organization goes, huh, he's not kidding. And it has a very, very salutary effect. So methods like this that drive culture from a nice thing on the wall to something that people actually get paid on and fired on and promoted on or not promoted on can be enormously valuable. Again, you got to repeat, repeat, repeat. So that's culture. And then there's alignment on execution, which is a hard problem for any manager, and especially at the rate of change in some of these startups. This is another business tool that I love. I mentioned Postini, a very dear friend of mine, Scott Petrie, the technical founder of Postini. They built really the first very effective security service in the cloud. So a totally web-based security service for screening emails for spam and the like. Business grew very fast, as I said, but then it went sideways. It did about $5 million a quarter for 6 or 7 quarters. The founders decided to bring in a new CEO, Quentin Gallivan, who's a very talented individual who came out of VeriSign. He joined early 2006 with this company that was going flat, but everybody thought had a lot of potential. He spent a bunch of time with his team, his senior management group, and put everything they needed to do that year to sort of make the business expand again and all its mojo into one page. Lots of discussion, negotiation. 2 things you'll see here is that every organization every team in the org has got some number of goals here, and there's lots and lots of numbers, right? It's not, improve our DSOs, it's improve DSOs from 50 to 45 days. And here's the key thing. They called this the Postini placemat because all he did, he laminated it, everyone had one, and at every meeting of his team, you had to come, you had to put your placemat down, your coffee and your placemat, and the only stuff anybody was allowed to talk about was what was on the placemat. And if the conversation was going to something that wasn't on here, it's like, nah, let's get back to what's on the placemat. Strategic, tactical, overall goals. This was one of a number of tools, just as we're being practical, that I've seen used to make organizations that are kind of all over the place kind of go, okay, we get it. This is where we're headed.
All right. So now that you've magically figured out your culture, found a team, figured out they're a fit, brought them on board, and started aligning them. One of the things I think people struggle with once they have all these great people is figuring out how to make decisions. Because actually, in the early days when it's just you, decision making is pretty darn easy. You kind of debate with yourself and talk to yourself and figure out what you want to do. And even with 2 or 3 people, it's relatively easy. I think it gets more complicated once you have more people, and especially when you have good people. So it's not just you telling 5 people what to do, but actually there's 3 or 4 people and you trust their opinions. So one of the things people struggle with, I think, is how do you decide when to decide yourself versus letting the team decide, and what's that dynamic? And it ties into what Harrison talked about, because it's all about getting people aligned. And this is really definitely an art to this. So one of the things I think is really important is making it very clear in your company, whether you have a very small company or even as you get bigger, what are the times when we're talking and discussing, and what are the times when we're executing, right? So let's say even if you're at the very beginning, you've got 5 people in your company or 2 people, what are the times when we're brainstorming about our product, and what are the times we're actually just going and building our product? And brainstorming can still happen, but basically we're executing on whatever plan there is. I think if you have constant decision and discussion and debate, it's hard to ever get anywhere, right? So that's one thing that's really important. And making it clear to people whether you're in a mode of kind of discussing or in a mode of actually executing. Second thing I've found is that, especially as you get bigger, it might feel to you like, as the founder or the CEO, like everyone wants input into what's going on. Everyone wants to decide. But the truth is, I think what people really want is to understand what's happening. So sometimes it gets confused. People will come to you and say, gosh, I want more input into the process of how we're deciding where to go as a company. And you'll ask them then, okay, great, what do you think? They'll be like, well, and really what they wanted was transparency. They wanted to know, why are we doing the things we're doing? What are we actually doing? And frankly, for a lot of people, that's all they want to know. They want to know that there's a well thought out plan that got us to this point, like the placemat that Harrison showed up, and that this all fits together in some way. And frankly, it's probably a lot like politics, right? Where for a lot of people, they just want to know that there is a method to the madness. They don't necessarily want to change it. They just want to know what the method is, right? How did you get to this answer? So explaining decision making is very important. And it ties into the last point. This is something I really feel very passionately about, which is, if you found a company, or the CEO, or even if you're an important leader, you have to believe in one thing, which is people want to be led. So there's probably this belief that somehow everyone can automatically self-organize and just automatically go in the right direction. And yeah, the birds do that. They fly in that V without, there's no bird that tells the other birds how to fly. But I think in companies and a lot of real life, there's actually a need for leaders. There's need for people to go help figure out what needs to happen and then kind of organize everyone the same way. And frankly, the whole word organization, a company is an organization. Organization is about organizing people along a common goal. And you really have to believe that as the founder of a company or the CEO or a leader, your job is to help lead the organization. And don't shy away from that. Sometimes there's a tendency to actually shy away from that, but that's actually your main job. And so when I think about that in my company, and one of the great things about, by the way, running your own company is you get to come up, use whatever crazy ideas you have on how to run your own company and make them your own. So I'm a huge football fan. So basically everything in my company is all done in football metaphors. So in our company, the way we would execute on these processes that Harrison talked about is we would have a phase of input every quarter, every 3 months. And we're a little bigger, so for a small company, it might be every week. And we call it game planning, where we'd kind of get everyone's input and get the senior, all the key people in a room and whiteboard all the different things we could do. And then we would come up with our kind of a version of that placemat that Harrison talked about, which is what we called our plays, which are basically, what do we want to get done this quarter, next 3 months, whatever time period we're talking about. And then at the end of that period, we'd do what we call film review, where we'd go back and kind of see what worked and what didn't, and that kind of thing, right? And just iterate. And what was really good about this was then people in the company that wanted input knew that they can always provide input, but they can provide input here, and they can provide some retrospective here. They get to get their thoughts out. And then they know that when you're in the middle of it, you're kind of executing, and everyone would use the term plays to define kind of what they're working on. So everyone used the same language, right? We put these up everywhere, and there'd be some high-level ones for the company, and then everyone's individual kind of goals would be tied to those, and you could kind of see what everyone's working on. And there's no magic to this. There's a million different ways to do this. They're all equally valid. The most important thing is to do it, to actually do it, to have a process, to have a way that you make decisions, to be clear about it, and to let people know what's happening and be transparent. And then just do it consistently. So what's really important, and what I was proud of, is we did this year after year, quarter after quarter. Postini had that placemat at their table every day. It's about making sure that whatever you define happens every time. So last one is the course correction. So you want to start here, or you? No. I'll go. So a couple things that you'll run into when you're creating this culture and building this team. You'll kind of start defining that culture. You'll bring in all these great people, And if you're really lucky, it'll all be smooth sailing for a while, but no matter what, you're going to hit some road bumps. And I hit a lot. Like, so as Harrison talked about, came into this company, great company, but some challenges. And then I made my own. It wasn't just challenges before. There were challenges I created too. I made some mistakes as well. For example, I brought in a person that was a great a resume, great fit. I mean, execution, awesome fit. Did a great job for the company, but just culturally was like absolute oil and water. Actually, with me, literally. So it wasn't actually just with the rest of the company. It was with me. And so you'll run into challenges. And what I find is culture and cultural challenges often fall into 3 buckets. So one, which you have to kind of get savvy about, is external challenges. So one of the weird things about culture is somehow, if you ask employees at different companies about their culture, the people whose companies are doing really well will often say that their cultures are great. And the people whose companies aren't doing well will often say their cultures aren't that great, right? So there's some element of bias where winning is a great part of culture. So as an example, I don't know if y'all remember the Netflix pricing change last year, right? And all the stuff that happened around that. I bet if you surveyed the employees of Netflix before that and after that, their view of the culture would be radically different. But the truth is, nothing changed about the Netflix culture in those few weeks. All that changed is the performance of the company. And so one thing you have to really separate out when you think about your culture is external factors. And frankly, as a CEO, you kind of have to ride those through. So if you believe in your culture, you have to kind of live through the ups and downs of the external. But then you think about what can you control, which is, oftentimes when cultures go awry and when people start complaining, it's because the leader isn't communicating enough. Basically, that person who's in charge and who's supposed to be creating that culture and running that regular cadence of, execution, decision-making, all the stuff we talked about, isn't doing their job. And that's kind of where you have to hold yourself accountable. And then sometimes it's actually because you made a bad hire, And so I kind of think most things fall into one of these 3 categories. Stuff on the bad on the outside's happening to your business. You're missing your job, or you actually just brought somebody in that was wrong, especially at a senior level. And Harrison talked about that with the person at Amazon. If I use my example, this guy I brought in was very, very experienced and did a great job, and literally for a whole year and a half, executed great. I mean, probably the best performing executive of my company in terms of all the metrics, and he was doing something very important for us. But at some point, we were like every meeting, oil and water. And it was actually embarrassing because I had all this heart and soul in my culture that I'd put into the company. And then I brought this guy who was just totally the opposite. And so eventually just had to do the exact same thing and literally just fired him. And honestly, I'd write a letter of recommendation for this guy because in a different culture, he would be amazing. In my culture, he was a total not fit, And so sometimes those bad apples, really, you do have to make that tough decision. So, a couple things on that. So when you get that bad apple, and you have somebody that you've mishired, and by the way, no matter who you are, you will make one bad hire or more. Everyone knows. Everyone in your company knows. So you'll start thinking about yourself, but everyone else will see it too. And so the more you kind of push that on the back burner and let that person, not live up to your culture, the more it causes collateral damage in your company. Because what ends up happening then is other people say, well, that guy gets a free pass. He doesn't have to be honest or hard work, whatever the cultural thing he's not fitting with, right? Or that person isn't aligned with our culture. So I don't need to anymore either, right? And then everything starts unraveling. So it's very, very important to think about that. Second thing I think about is, it's kind of harsh, is that culture is not very coachable, So if you hire a salesperson and they're not very good at, closing a deal, you could probably go train them on how to close a deal. You hire an engineer and they know C#, but they don't know Java. You can go train them on Java. You hire somebody who's not honest. You can't train them on honesty. You can't. I mean, their mom should have trained them on honesty, right? 20 years ago. You can't. It's just a person that's just not a fit. And it's really tough. That's definitely one of the toughest things. Last thing though is, that's all theoretical. What ends up happening is you have a person that's a superstar and they're not a cultural fit. And that's actually where the compromises happen. I made a compromise. For a year and a half, I had this person around who was not a fit, but was doing a great job. And I was kind of sitting there every month and hoping that their culture would change and they would, this guy wasn't a very nice guy. So he'd go from yelling in the office to being a super nice guy. I was hoping that would happen one night and it never did. And my lesson is you will make compromises. The reality is no company is perfect. You will have bad apples. But if you keep them long-term, it's impossible to build a great company. If your goal is to build a great company, it is literally impossible to do it by keeping bad apples around. So it's sort of one of those things to keep in your back of your mind. I'm keeping this person around. Might even, God forbid, it might even be a co-founder. I mean, that's like the hardest situation, right? is it's a co-founder, and I am now stuck between this horrible, messy co-founder divorce, or never building, or basically accepting I'll never build a great company. And it's really, really tough. But that's those are the tough things you have to think about when you're running the show. So
again, yeah, one more thing before we do the workshop exercise. But what about questions?
Yeah.
We've been sort of talking fast and throwing a lot out here. Thoughts, observations, questions?
I guess when you're making individual hiring decisions, how do you prioritize diversity and its impact on company culture?
it's a great question. I could start and you want to chime in. So actually, I think about that a lot because one of the things that when we defined our culture, I wanted to have a small number of things that were very important for us to all have, but then have lots of diversity around that, right? So actually, if you have a list of 100 different things that everyone has to be, you end up with this like monochrome culture where everyone's the exact same. I'm not just talking about like ethnic diversity or gender diversity, just in general. And I think diversity is super helpful to make sure a company can kind of go through the ups and downs. And so for me, what it was all about was defining a very small number of things that we're not going to be diverse about. So I had those things that were important to us: reliability, compassion, et cetera. And then everything else, we actually wanted diversity as much as possible. So at least for us, what you see from other companies.
So, clearly diversity is valuable of all types, except of the type that you're talking about. And I would say, diversity, the ability to say, you know what, I'm just calling it, this person's not working out. It all kind of goes back to my earlier point is you just got to force yourself to make the time to develop talent and to recruit, because where you get desperate and make all these compromises, a lot of people, this is an issue in technology in general, is growth companies, they think like diversity, for instance, I don't have time for that. Leave that to the Fortune 500 companies. You got lots of, I got to find an engineer and I don't care, So making the time to give yourself choices is a really important thing to do. And in my leadership career, my management career, and now what I do, you constantly backslide into putting out that next fire. And I think it's important.
Other questions?
Others?
So when you're talking about joining your company, you said that they had the immersion culture existing,
Yep.
and that you brought in aspirational and personal. Were those lacking before?
Great question. There
Yes.
were.
Yeah.
He's the investor in the company, so
Yeah.
he would probably give you the candid answer. I think there were personal elements of the culture that were related to the founders of the company. So there were actually some personal elements as well. But yeah, there was probably not as much of an integrated culture at that point in general.
Well, no, it's that's why having Nick here is valuable, because that was a business that had to be all about reliability and all about customer satisfaction and follow through and discipline and getting from 2 nines to 5 nines and all of that, and that just wasn't the DNA. I thought it was when I invested, but people can snow you, right? so it really was kind of a culture transplant that was long and hard, but made a big difference. In the Postini case, actually all the values that you needed were people that had that in them, but they needed the leadership to say, thou shalt focus. And that business grew. I mean, I don't know, we could have had a real wreck at LiveOffice, and it was sold very successfully. Symantec, 3-4 years of hard work later. From the time of the placemat I told you about to 18 months later, Google acquired Postini for 6 times what we could have sold it for, pre-placemat, not putting it all in the placemat. So different companies, need different levels of surgery, but culture is one of the longest ones to turn.
Other question?
Yeah, no,
Sure.
How do you distinguish between something that's a cultural component and a perk, right? So,
Yeah.
and for example, is Google's 20% time a perk of being an engineer there, or is that something cultural to Google? But I mean, that's an easy example, but with maybe more harder examples where it's hard to distinguish. How would you define the distinction?
Well, I won't speak, for Google, or obviously they're incredible. But I would say that in today's environment in the Valley, for people, like many of you coming out with sort of engineering degrees that are highly prized, there's this huge battle for talent, and part of what results from that, not so much the 20% time, but all the the private chefs and people at Zynga where everyone's bringing home like trays of food to live for the weekend and stuff like that. that stuff can be really, perilous, and people end up with this sense of entitlement that is problematic. And with our companies in the Valley, it's something we try to really watch, not for financial reasons, but just because a sense of entitlement can often make you sloppy and you're going to miss, important stuff. Again, one of the cultural norms that Bezos was always driving was, we are a 25% gross margin business. We're going to spend like heck on stuff that affects the customer, but internally, we stayed at flea bag hotels and the famous door desks and all that. So I do think that, you need to be thoughtful, especially in the very heady, frothy environment that we're in now within internet and related disciplines, in the Valley, about thinking, where do you need to be tough, and where do you not need to be? Which is
one other thought on that is, I think, is one litmus test on culture versus perk. Does it matter to you as the founder, or is it something you're doing just to recruit people? Look, I could give you a 10-page, a one-page how-to guide on how to create a startup with perks, right? Go buy your scooters and buy your, Odwalla drinks in the fridge, and go do your hackathons or whatever. And every startup does that. But what's the thing that matters to you, and that you actually do because you care about it, right? If it's not that, it's probably not really part of the culture. It's probably just something you're doing to recruit people, which is fine too, by the way.
So kind of a follow-up to that question, if you're a small company, how do you recruit against those kinds of perks that maybe employees value, but that you just don't have the means to provide?
Yeah, that's great. So, and I imagine you all have felt this in your career or felt the opposite of it. It's extraordinary what people will do and the choices that they will make because they want to follow, they want to be a part of a group that touches something in there that is in them that is aspirational. I don't know any other way to say it. So you look at these guys over at Wildfire, a company I love, they've got this magic going where people turn down jobs that pay twice as much at Facebook and Google, and they come and work there because there's this sort of esprit de corps around going forth, being excellent at what you do, being great to each other, yes, having fun, but sort of in proportion. And that can be very, very powerful. Plus the ability, obviously, to be in on something new. What makes this Valley so incredible, and America in general, and especially the Valley, is that recurring dream of I can be in on something that really is big, financially and non-financially. I think you sort of you have to compete on that, and I think you can. I know you can because a lot of companies do.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.